Hello. Hi, Olivia. Liv.
Hi.
Hi. So today is the 28th of June, and it's literally 1 minute after 1 in the afternoon here in Germany. And with us, we have Liv, and Liv is story number 20 in this series. And let's start. Liv, tell us a little bit about yourself, tell us where you are, and let's get started.
Hi. I am from Auckland, New Zealand, and I have been living in Sydney, Australia for 3 years. Um, and so I work as a research assistant at the School of Public Health at the University of Sydney.
Then you are one of the lucky few in the world right now, from a good country, in a good country. COVID, right? When we speak about the pandemic, you're in a good spot. Tell us, so you just told us a little bit of where you work, but were you doing something different right before the pandemic started? And how has it changed your work? Did you have to reinvent yourself or not at all?
Not at all. I've been very lucky in that my job's really easy to do from home. So it was just a matter of taking everything home and doing it from my bedroom. And because I think we work with colleagues around in different cities sometimes anyway, or different campuses, we're so used to having lots of Zoom meetings and everything. So not much changed at all, really. We had lots of sort of social Zoom catch-ups with work, and had like a very good sort of community. But I think it was quite overwhelming at times because it was in public health, so it was a lot more like COVID just dominated every single conversation we were having.
And you mentioned it was a little bit more difficult, but was it also better in a sense? So you were more aware of what was happening in Australia, so in Sydney, or or do you think maybe it would have been better if I was working marketing or something?
No, I think on the whole it was probably better. I think I definitely got maybe more information, more high quality information. But I think just the fact that it dominated so much of your conversation, even social, and I think that's probably the same for most people, but it was just very, very hard to escape it. And like finding myself sort of like having to like restrict watching the news too much. And because you kind of I just then realized that all the information that I was getting, I would get from people that I was talking to on a regular basis. But yeah, it was quite good being around people that are so educated in that field. And so, when you're discussing it, you're discussing, things that are evidence-based, or like things like you're not exposed to sort of misinformation like there's been a lot of.
Too much.
Yeah.
Too much around. But yes, this phenomenon that of being overexposed to the news, to what's happening, and constantly talking about it is something that, like you said, has happened to most people around the world. I guess at different stages, depending on when the pandemic really started in that country. But unfortunately, one of the bad things is that there's more and more people that just don't want to know anything about it. And so you also have people that think, it's over, it's done with, and forget about the lessons that we're constantly learning in these past months. And it's a little bit, it's a pity, and it's a bit scary, right? You can't just decide you don't want to know about it anymore. You want it to stop. Of course, you can decide how much of it you get a day, but you shouldn't completely ignore it. Recently, I was speaking to someone from Peru, and they were telling me that this overflow of information, constant information, and also, like you were saying, a lot of misinformation has enabled people to just basically say enough is enough. They don't want to watch the news, they don't want to know anything anymore, and they're not taking the necessary precautions, right? So how is it in Australia? I'm assuming we've been watching in the news that there's some, let's not get too much into it, but there's a few outbreaks in Australia right now. So I'm assuming even the people that were thinking, you know, let's tone it down, this COVID-19 talk, now they're talking again about it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely, most of my conversations now are about Melbourne, really, and the clusters that are happening there. Again, we're so lucky in Sydney. I think there's only 7 cases in Sydney, so it's not the same conversation. It's not the whole like anxiety driven conversation. It's just concern for what's happening in Melbourne, but also just a relief that maybe we're not there.
So more cautious, let's watch what's happening, feel for
Yeah.
what's happening, but also be careful that it doesn't
Yeah.
happen to us.
Yeah, and just I think, yeah, learning from them, and just I think hopefully it's making people aware that there is a real risk of a second wave, whereas I think there's a lot of talk, because I think the social distancing and all the precautions that we've been taking have been so successful, that it's quite easy for people to think that, oh, maybe we overreacted, or maybe it wasn't that bad because of what we're doing worked. So it's almost, hopefully, could be quite powerful to see that actually this is all it takes for other outbreaks and community transmission to happen again, which is why it's so important when we're easing restrictions to still be vigilant and cautious, I think.
Yeah, it's exactly. It shows that no matter how well your country is doing, the country where you live in, like you said, you just have to keep on doing the job, right? Doing it well. So let's stay with Australia, since we already started talking about Australia. Tell me, aside from the outbreaks that have happened, that are happening in Melbourne, what else is in the news? So always pandemic related, but what else is happening? What is the topic that you are hearing and talking about and watching in the news?
So one thing, I guess, sort of even related to Melbourne, one thing is the state borders, which are quite confusing. Some of the individual states have closed their borders to the other states, and there's been a little bit of some of the state premiers are getting a bit like almost shitty with each other. So yeah, like Queensland closed their borders to everybody for a while, and then, you know, New South Wales is trying to be like, hey, let us in, or, you know, and so they actually just announced today, Queensland, that they are opening their borders to the rest of the country, I think on the 10th of July. And other than that, I think another thing is just that, I guess, the easing of restrictions, which is like a sort of staggered approach. And I think from the 1st of July, more restrictions are lifted. So I think you can have maybe, and I think it's more than 20 people in an outdoor space. So things are sort of, more things are opening now. And I think that's the main conversation in the media. But yeah, it really seems to be all about the Victorian clusters.
The Victorian cluster.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you can tell us about the Victorian clusters, or something that maybe has not yet reached international news, or maybe something that should be more emphasized in international news?
I think one thing I've noticed is that there seems to be a lot of blaming of the people. So the people that have maybe been infected working at the quarantine hotels, and they've gone home and they've created a cluster. But a lot of them are from countries they don't speak English as their first language, and they just haven't been provided with enough like infection control training, personal protective equipment, and they haven't been provided with maybe adequate communication in their language about it. So I think that really highlights just the issue of communicating properly to everybody. And I think in such a multicultural country, it's really important that all of your people are getting the same message. Otherwise, it's just going to, disproportionately affect the either like minority groups or people that are socio-economically disadvantaged. So I think that should be more of the story than
actually saying it's their fault or we did our part. But blaming others, finger pointing, even in March, April, it has shown that it doesn't help. It just makes things worse. So
there's been a lot of that. Like obviously, most of the cases in New South Wales came from the Ruby Princess disaster, which instead of sort of managing that better, it was a lot of sort of finger pointing, like, oh, let's blame this person, let's blame, find the culprit, but that doesn't really achieve that much.
No, not now, at least. Better, okay, there is something that went wrong. Let's figure out what went wrong, how it went wrong, and ensure that doesn't happen again. And whatever lessons you learn from that, maybe see if they can also be implemented in other types of situations. That is what we need, right? From the very beginning of the pandemic, one of the main things that was said, aside from test, was you need to react. You can't, yes, of course, you need to study the situation and think about the situation, but you don't have weeks and months and years to discuss about it. No, it's
that's really true. And I think that's led, you have to make those decisions, those really hard decisions very quickly, not based on a whole lot of evidence because it doesn't exist yet, because you can't wait for the evidence.
Makes it all even harder. And talking about making things harder, as you know, New Zealand has been a story of hope, of inspiration, that just shows that when the community, so when all the citizens put their part, then things can be done. When the government is clear, gives just a transparent look at what is happening, what can happen, what shouldn't happen, and what needs to be done, things can work, right? So for a long time, and yes, there's the skepticals that say, oh, but New Zealand is so far away, and New Zealand, there's barely any people there, and that's why everything's fine. Maybe there's a little bit of truth in it. I mean, yes, there is a little bit of truth, but that's not why it has done well.
No. Well, exactly. I think it's very easy to sit there and be like, oh, you're so far away, you're so small, you're not densely populated. But at the same time, we started to get that sort of incline in cases. You started to get that increase and the first sign of community transmission when they shut it down. So if they didn't shut it down, we would be seeing something like a million times worse than what we actually saw. So, and like all of that is from that, like their response and that clear, empathetic messaging. And I think what they did really well was just this message of unity. It was all about, we are doing this together. We're all staying home. We're doing this together as a country to save lives.
Exactly.
And I think,
a united front, right? Something for everybody, not against something, because as you've seen, there's been some countries that have spoken about the virus as if it was an enemy and we were or they were at war. which
Yeah,
uh, I'm still undecided if it's a good approach or not.
I agree. I've been having that same sort of, yeah, thoughts about there's a lot of similarities in the terminology that we're using to liken it to like we're going to battle, like the doctors and stuff are these, you know, war front heroes. And yeah, you know, and like people that are working in the supermarket, they're on the front line. And I don't know how appropriate it is to be using such forceful war terminology.
Exactly, especially because, at least how I think of it, is that using such terminology kind of gives you or gives the country, gives the government the okay to think, well, you know, in a war you lose people, so if some, you know, essential
Mm,
workers die, yes, it is sad, but it's expected. And
mhm.
no, it shouldn't be expected, and it can't be okayed from the beginning just because you have this type of conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, like language terminology, it's so important. Um, so that's really interesting. And like, yeah, talking about the sort of your supermarket staff, your nurses, your doctors as being on the front line, it almost makes, you know, they're at such an increased risk. So if you sacrifice a couple of them, maybe you can still win the war, but that's not really what anybody wants.
No, not at all. And that's why New Zealand's approach and just their communication skills, because that's
Mm,
what it is also, knowing how to communicate in a difficult situation. Uh, yeah,
mm,
the saying unity, what you were just saying, right? It's all of us together working for each other. And also the fact, the more you do now, the less you will have to do later, right?
exactly. I know. Like my family went to, like my brother went to a rugby game last night, which was had about 40,000 people at, which, like, you know, that's massive. No, you know, there's no other stadium in the world that's having that many people at the moment, which is really cool. And that's because they did those hard yards early and they got the message out and they all united.
Exactly. And unfortunately, barely anybody else can say that in the world.
Mm,
You know, 40,000 people at a game right now is a thing of the past and a dream of very far away future for many.
right. It
So,
was, yeah, it was really, really heartwarming. Like it got goosebumps just watching it. It's really
and
special.
did the team that your brother
Yeah,
cheers
it's
for, did they
white.
win? Yeah. Okay. That's good. Um, talking, let's stay a little bit longer with New Zealand, because you have mentioned two things. First, you mentioned a little bit earlier how Australia, the different states were looking into opening and letting other people come in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it just made me think, okay, one of the things that's happening here in Europe is that it's been a few days, a few weeks that countries from the European Union can have started to really travel within countries. And
Mm,
now come July, the borders will be open, the EU borders will be open to a lot of countries. I know that New Zealand, as we were saying, has done very well. And unfortunately, last week, if I'm not mistaken, or a little bit longer, there was the issue that for 24 days, around 24 days, New Zealand has 0 cases every single day. And then suddenly that stopped. And that stopped because you had imported cases, that people that traveled to New Zealand were unfortunately positive. Thinking of how that changes the reality, because you said, okay, it's also a fact that you have people that, you know, are basically living, it's back to normal.
mm,
And so having 2 cases, it's a bigger fear, right?
Yeah.
Than just a couple or even a lot of daily cases that, it's the norm, which should never be the norm, but it's not as scary as going from 0 for a long time to 2. Taking that into consideration, can you just tell us a little bit more about, since that happened, what are the next steps? What measures has New Zealand taken with just flights coming in from abroad, and what is Australia's look into it? For instance, can I go to Australia coming from Germany, where we also had outbreaks right now,
Mm-hmm.
or just people from New Zealand can travel, and what are the measures?
So in New Zealand and Australia, the borders are both closed unless you're a New Zealand citizen, permanent resident, or family member. So the people that are the imported cases that are coming, there are only New Zealanders returning. So I could go home, but I'd have to quarantine. But say my South African flatmate couldn't fly into New Zealand. And in terms of what that means, basically, so the first 2 cases, they were given exemption to go to a funeral, and they drove 8 hours from Auckland to Wellington. But that, I think, so basically since that, they've put a stop to all compassionate exemptions, which is a real shame for people that may have, really needed that. So that's a bit of a bummer. So, and I think they're just investigating how that happened, just to ensure that it doesn't happen again, because New Zealand's so reliant on having that working flawlessly, because, like you said, we've got no restrictions in the rest of the country. And so for the last few months, we've New Zealand and Australia have been in talks with opening a trans-Tasman bubble, which would mean, we can go to and from without having the mandatory quarantine period, which looked quite promising. And there was sort of people talking, maybe July, but now with COVID, the cases in Melbourne, but also we need to sort out the border situation in New Zealand, especially because some countries have gone obviously for a mitigation approach, whereas I think New Zealand has gone for an elimination approach, which is why I think when you have 0 cases for 24 days and you have then 2 or a couple, that's a big deal. And it's a lot more of a big deal than if you are going for a mitigation approach where you're going to have that steady sort of couple of cases. It's not sort of to be expected. And so now I actually keep seeing in the newspapers saying the trans-Tasman bubble's not going to happen, and this is the reason why. I'm like, I just want to go home.
Well, yeah, it is a fear, right? Especially, I assume, how much are you or the people so your family and friends are watching what's happening around the world? Because there's also that fear, right? Yes, it would be great to have between Australia and New Zealand just inflow, especially obviously if you guys are in the same level, right? But there's also the fear what happened in New Zealand, but also what you're watching in Europe, in the States, and because we have seen, for instance, in the United States, one of the reason why things just have gotten worse and are getting worse is because a few months ago, there were so many flights that were still going on. So people from, the north going to the south, from the east to the west. And yes, the United States is a very big country, but, there's other big countries in the world. And moving around when there's a virus hanging around is, yeah. What do you say from what you see?
Well, I think we're just really lucky that we don't have the same risk traveling around, because there are no cases. as soon as we went into restrictions like sort of level 1, there were just, so many sales on domestic flights. You could just jump on, they're really, really encouraging sort of domestic tourism. So I think we're really lucky.
Yeah, you can
in that
do
regard.
that. You can have that because
Yeah,
you took measures
mm,
right from the beginning, right?
mm,
And did the work at the beginning. And talking about measures, you've already mentioned a couple of things that were done in New Zealand and in Australia, but could you maybe just, if there's something else that you would share from either country or both countries, some of the measures that were taken, were done?
mm-hmm. So very similar to start with. I remember some of the first things that they did was they introduced the 2-week quarantine for people returning from overseas, which had been mid-March. About the 15th of March, I think. And for the first while, it was almost like Jacinda Ardern would announce something, and then the following day, Scott Morrison, the PM of Australia, would announce something very, very similar. So it was all it was just waiting to see what she would do and then copy. And it was
a good person to copy, right?
Yeah, right. So then they restricted gatherings to 100 people, closed gyms, cinemas, restaurants, all those sort of things. And that was very similar. But then when it got different was when New Zealand announced their lockdown. So their full level 4 lockdown, which basically meant everything was closed except for your essential services, which Australia also said the same thing, but they had a very different definition of what essential was. So they basically said, stay home unless you go to the grocery shopping or blah, 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 blah. But then everything was still open. So there's still lots of retail shops open and cafes could do takeaways and everything. So you're like, oh, okay, so if it's open, am I allowed to go? And Scott, the first few weeks, he would sort of make weird comments and be like, oh, well, you can't do this, but you can do this. But hairdressers are open, but you have to be out of there by 30 minutes and blah, blah, blah. And it was just a bit like, okay, so what can I do? What can't I do? I mean, it was easy for me because I just didn't do anything. I just basically for those few weeks, I just pretended that I was
in New Zealand.
And the New Zealand rules applied for me because it was easier. I wasn't being like, oh shit, can I do this? Can I?
Better.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah.
And what do your parents and your family say? Because in the end, right now with the outbreaks in Melbourne, are they a little bit worried, or they know, just to have a understanding? Because as we said from the beginning, you are one of the few lucky ones that you are from it sounds so bad to say, but it's a good country because pandemic talking, right? So from a good country, in a good country. Is your family and friends back home, are they a little bit worried or not?
No, I don't think anybody's really worried. Maybe if it would be a different story if I was in Melbourne, but I think, both our countries have handled it very well. So I think, there's not actually that much to worry about, which is really, really, really grateful about. So obviously I think it's for us, it's more just like, oh, when can I go home? Which is actually, if that's my biggest concern in the middle of a pandemic, that's okay.
Yeah. More than okay, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
You just mentioned if my concern is, when can I go home? And we're in the middle of a pandemic. So it's a realization that basically you're doing well. So staying with realizations, when was it that you, Olivia, realized that the situation, the pandemic, was more serious than what you thought or what people were saying? Was there a specific moment, or was it gradual? Did you read an article, watch something, or How did it
So I
happen?
think
When did it happen?
I always knew that it was serious. Um, I remember the first time that it affected me was I had a plan to go home in April for one of my best high school friends' wedding, and I remember I was out in the last time I was in a bar, and it was just like, you know, having some Friday night drinks, and they'd just announced that everybody coming into New Zealand had to quarantine for 2 weeks. And so that was the moment, and I was like, oh shit, I can't go home for the wedding because I would need to go 2 weeks before. And that was when it didn't even cross my mind that the borders would close and I wouldn't be able to, and that they'd end up having to escalate. It would be escalated so quickly. So that was that moment that I was like, oh shit, okay, this is escalating quickly. And then basically within 2 weeks we were all on like full lockdown. The wedding was cancelled. I think that was probably my moment.
Moment of
Yeah.
every moment, and actually, regardless of the situation in your country, every moment is quite different. I know some people that even when their country went into lockdown, they still, yes, it was something serious, but it wasn't their moment, let's say.
Yeah. I think the fact that I worked in public health, I felt like I always had this like sort of moral responsibility to do everything right. So I had like stopped going to the gym or stopped getting like, you know, going out like a couple of weeks before you couldn't. And so I was living a very boring existence for a while people were still going out. Like my flatmates kept going out, which kind of meant that it was almost like I didn't really gain anything by doing all the stuff because my flatmates would go out and then they'd come back and like, or they'd have people, you know, they had people over when they shouldn't have. They had like too many people over. It was like, you know, disobeying the social distancing rules, and that just made me so anxious. Things like that. That it was like, guys, can't you see that this is really serious? This is not the time to be entertaining like 10 of your friends.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's it's your knowledge and understanding that helped your frustrations, right, with what happens around. And but going back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about your concern of, okay, when can I go home, right? Can you tell me, do you have any other concerns for either New Zealand or Australia? Just tell us a little bit about what are your hopes, what are your concerns, what is it that you think that's going to happen in the next few days, next few weeks, taking into consideration, for instance, what's happening in Melbourne. What is it that you don't want to happen? And it's also quite interesting because we see your reasoning as live just a person, but also live, you know, that works in a public health environment.
So I think there's always like a little bit of a concern of a second wave, and I think the knowledge that if a second wave happens, you're not going to have the same compliance. You're not going to have the same, say, like if a second wave happens in New Zealand, no one's going to lock down and do what they've been told because it wasn't, you know, their fault. You know, if they let imported cases come in, like cause community transmission, there's no way Kiwis would just give up their job, you know, basically sacrifice so much again after they'd been through so much. So I think there's that. There's also with restrictions easing, things is like very nearly back to normal. I think it's just concern, like you don't get too complacent and like you just sort of are still being cautious and vigilant. I think that's more mainly the decision makers. And one thing I feel like, not necessarily about the country and the government, but I just feel like I don't want to lose what I've learnt over the last few months. So almost like I hope that we sort of learn from everything that we've been through in terms of not even just like managing the pandemic, but just, I think the way we've lived in the last 3 months has made me realize like what is actually important to me. And I feel like it's been really like almost nice to be like, go back to the basics. And I just really want to hold on to some of these things. Like you don't have to be busy all the time. You don't have to have all these plans, and you can just stay at home and read a book, and that's fine. You don't, it's just,
you don't need
like
that 10th
yeah,
dress,
yeah, and just little things like that it makes me a bit apprehensive to go back into the world. Yeah, I'm feeling, I do feel a bit anxious about sort of going back in the world as normal, because I feel like everything has changed, but then also nothing has changed. So it just seems like it's all of a sudden going back to normal, and I'm a bit like, I don't know if I'm quite ready, but it's not, I can't really put it into emotion. Why? Because there are so many things that I have missed. But actually, I'm surprised that I didn't miss them as much. Like I love going out for drinks. I love, going to a pub with my friends and doing all these sort of things. But it's made me, I didn't miss them as much as I thought. Maybe because I still had all of the connection with the people that I was really close to. And I put more effort in, spending time and talking to the people that I really value. But, so I hope I can hold on to that. And I think
hold on to those values. And yeah, like you said, it's also okay to stay home and read a good book. And right, and also okay to understand that you don't need to consume.
Yeah.
But also it's also nice to just enjoy the moment, enjoy the people, just with the basic things, right? And of course, this always people should keep in mind that all of these stories, while they're obviously stories about the people and the country that they're from, the countries that we're talking about, it's their perspectives, because you are someone from New Zealand that is living in Australia, you can think of this going back to normal and wishing to hold to some of the things that you have learned in the last few months. Again, very lucky, and again, something that unfortunately many people in many countries should not be thinking, because they are not in a place to be thinking about going back to normal. We still need to be cautious, and some countries more than others, right? But yeah, I completely understand what you're saying of understanding more what is more important, right? It's part of the nice things that the pandemic has shown, right?
I think, especially for people that are lucky enough to have, a home where they're happy and like a job that's paying through that time. Like I think if it was the fact, I'd lost my job or something, I think that would be a whole different ball game. And I think it's a very privileged position for me to sit here and be like, say, I've learned things, that rather than spend the entire 3 months, stressing about, making a living or providing for other people. So also just privileged position where I am. The fact that I'm, in Australia, and
definitely
my family are all safe.
Yeah, exactly. But again, just like you are privileged in your position, there are other people around the world that are also privileged. So it's nice to show them your experience. It's nice to inform them of your learnings, and it's nice to make them think of things that, you know, maybe they didn't think. You may have privileged people that are just constantly thinking, oh, I can't wait to just, you know, go partying every day like I used to,
Mm.
and make them wonder, you don't have to. Didn't you
Mm.
enjoy that book you read the other night with your glass of wine, right? Liv, it has been really nice talking to you, and thank you very much. So my day is just starting here, but your day is ending. It's time to sleep or have your glass of wine and your book. But before you do that, so before we say goodbye to each other, I just have one more question. If you could speak to Liv, so if you could speak to your future self, the Liv that will be here in 14 days, and you could give her a message, what would you tell her?
um, I would tell her to think about how to spend her time. Think, do things and see people that bring joy to your lives and lift you up. I think that's what I would say.
It's a very good message, positive, and I like it. So you will say it in 14 days, and I will see you in 14 days.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
You have a good day.
Yeah. Bye.